The city of Atlanta does not slow down for anyone. It moves the way money moves fast, deliberate, indifferent to whatever falls beneath it. 47 floors of glass and ambition rise above Peachtree Street on a Monday morning, and inside that building, 2,400 people are already in motion. Elevators ascending, decisions being made. A woman in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent walks through the marble lobby like she owns it because she does. And then a sound. Small, wrong, a mop bucket, tipping. Water spreading across polished stone in the particular silence of a thing that cannot be undone. A man on his knees, uniform blue, eyes steady, not flinching, not retreating. Just still, in a way that doesn't belong to this lobby, this morning, this moment. The woman's voice cuts through the air like a verdict. He does not look away. Something is about to happen in this building. Something that has been waiting, quietly, for 2 years. The morning always started the same way. Wheels on marble. The low slosh of water in a bucket. Footsteps that didn't hurry and didn't drag, just moved. Steady and deliberate, like a man who had long ago made peace with the distance between where he was and where he used to be. Darnell Cop pushed his mop cart through the main corridor of Reed Capitol Tower at 6:43 in the morning, and the building hadn't fully woken up yet. Atlanta was still gray outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the kind of gray that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be fog or just the sky's way of acknowledging that Mondays were hard on everyone. A few programmers shuffled toward the elevator bank, eyes down, coffee cups, doing all the heavy lifting. 2 security guards swapped shifts at the front desk with the enthusiasm of men trading one mild inconvenience for another. Nobody looked at Darnell. That wasn't bitterness talking. That was just how large buildings operated. The people who kept them running were the people most successfully rendered invisible by them. He was one of 11 in a building of 2,400 whose job was to make everything look like nobody had ever touched it. It was specific work, it required attention, and it suited him in ways he hadn't fully anticipated when he took it 2 years ago. Back when the primary qualification he was looking for was proximity to Briarwood, and a shift that ended before 3. He adjusted the cart's front wheel. It pulled left, had been pulling left for 6 weeks, and the requisition form for a replacement had been submitted, lost, resubmitted, and was currently in a procurement pipeline managed by a man named Gerald who Darnell had never met and was beginning to suspect did not actually exist. He compensated without thinking about it. The correction was automatic, built into his movement, the way all corrections eventually become not effort, just adjustment. He worked the corridor in a systematic Z pattern, the way he'd been trained to clear a space, not by a janitorial manual, but by 15 years of moving through environments where overlooking a detail in the wrong corner cost more than a performance review. The habit never left. Once you learned to read a room that way, you couldn't unlearn it. You redirected it toward less consequential things. Scuff marks near the reception desk. Lobby trash concentrated around the far trash can that people overshot on their way in. The particular arc of a coffee spill near the elevator bay, where someone clearly tried to multitask every single morning and had never once succeeded. He knew the building the way sailors know a ship, not because he'd studied it, but because he'd been present inside it long enough that the building had stopped performing for him. The 3rd floor east stairwell smelled like someone's lunch by 11 a.m. The HVAC on the 9th floor ran cold enough in January that you could see your breath if you stood still long enough. The executive bathrooms on 38 were cleaned twice daily, while the staff bathrooms on 17 were handled once in theory. He knew which lobby plants were real and which were not. He knew which security camera had a 4-second lag when it swept left. He knew these things because he noticed things. Because noticing was the oldest habit he had, older than the military, older than the tattoo on his forearm that nobody here had looked at long enough to read. He wasn't thinking about any of that now. He was thinking about the drainage under the main entrance mat, which had a history of pooling after rain, which there had been Sunday night, which meant the mat was currently functioning less as a welcome surface and more as a contained flood with better aesthetics. He crossed toward it, crouched down, lifted the edge, wet. Predictably, he pulled the mat back, reached for the small squeegee on the lower rack of the cart, and started working the pooled water toward the drain channel. The building's morning rush was picking up footsteps, multiplying, the elevator banks dinging in irregular rhythms, the low white noise of a large organization loading itself up for the week. He worked without looking up. He'd learned long ago that the most effective way to do careful work in a crowded space was to be fully aware of your surroundings, while appearing completely absorbed in your task. The two things were not in conflict. They were the same skill applied at different frequencies. He was aware, for instance, of the exact moment the energy in the lobby changed. It wasn't loud. It never was with her. It was the way other footsteps adjusted that unconscious gravitational deference that large groups of people extend to whoever they have collectively decided matters. He noted it the way he noted everything. Filed it. Did not look up. The footsteps came fast. Heels on marble. A stride that assumed the path would be clear because it had always been clear. He had put out the wet floor signs. Both of them. Yellow, positioned at regulation distance on either side of the work area. He had checked them when he started. He checked everything twice, not because the manual required it, but because the manual had never worked in the kind of conditions where checking twice was the difference between an outcome you could live with and one you couldn't. The heel caught the edge of the still damp section just past the mat, the section he hadn't finished yet. Technically outside the cone zone, but carrying residual moisture from the drainage work. He heard it before he registered it. That fractional half squeak of rubber on wet stone, the interrupted pause of a stride that expected solid ground and found something else. She didn't fall. Her hand shot out and caught the edge of the waiting area armchair, a reflex, fast and controlled in the way near disasters produce control in people who have enough muscle memory to override panic. But in the recovery motion, her leather document portfolio swung wide and made full contact with the side of his cart. The bucket went over completely, with the commitment that only objects obeying physics can achieve. Water spread across the marble in a slow, widening arc, unhurried the way expensive problems always seem to move, like they have nowhere particular to be, and all the time they need to get there. Darnell was already moving. Cart upright first stopped the secondary spill from the supply shelf. Then the mop, cutting across the leading edge of the water before it reached the elevator bay carpet. His body didn't wait for authorization. It just moved, the way it had been trained to move when a situation shifted faster than thinking aloud. He crouched. Worked the floor. Didn't look up. What is this? Not a question. The punctuation was unmistakably a period. I'm getting it handled, ma'am. I can see that. What I'm asking is why there is a lake in my lobby on a Monday morning. He sat back on his heels, looked up. Monica Reed was 47 years old and looked exactly like a woman who had not waited anyone's permission to become what she was. Medium height. Dark suit that didn't try to impress you because it didn't need to. A single watch rose gold. Nothing ostentatious. Nothing that could snag on a negotiating table or signal anything she hadn't chosen to signal. Her face was striking in the way of someone who had stopped thinking about their face a long time ago because there were more interesting things to think about. The structure still there, the attention it drew still present, neither of those things her primary concern. She was looking at him the way she probably looked at a balance sheet that wasn't reconciling. I was clearing drainage under the entrance mat, he said. Water retention from last night's rain. The signs were up. The signs. 2 of them. Regulation placement. Her eyes moved briefly toward the signs, registered them, moved back. Those signs are positioned for the mat area, she said. Not for the 6 square feet beyond it where my shoes are now wet. He looked at her shoes. They were. A fine spray had caught the toe of the left one. He looked back at her. She had an audience, and she knew it, the 2 employees who'd slowed without quite stopping. Patricia at the front desk, doing the thing where you stare at your computer screen with unusual intensity while tracking everything else in the room. Monica Reed didn't adjust for an audience. That was its own kind of statement. "I understand," he said. "I'll have it dry before your client arrives." "That's not." She stopped, then didn't stop. Took one step closer, her voice dropping not in softness but in concentration. The register of someone who has something specific they want to land. "You know what the problem is? People in your position don't see past the immediate task. You see the mat, you see the water. You don't see the client who is supposed to walk through that door in 38 minutes, or what it communicates about this building, when the first thing she encounters is this, the word this, doing a lot of heavy lifting. Carrying maybe a dozen meanings, none of them generous. Darnell didn't move, didn't look away, didn't perform any of the retreats the moment seemed to be waiting for, the ducked head, the apologetic hunch, the visible bracing of a person absorbing something they've decided to absorb. He just held the mop handle and looked at her with the steadiness of a man who had been genuinely cold, genuinely hungry, genuinely uncertain whether he would see the following morning, and had learned through that experience to calibrate accordingly. "You're right that I don't see the full picture," he said. His voice was even, not flat, not aggressive, not performing patience. Even the way a horizon is even, extending in both directions without preference. "I see what I'm here to handle. Right now, that's a floor that needs to be dry before your client arrives. I'm working on that." Something moved across her face. Not quite surprised, something adjacent. The slight internal adjustment of a person who expected a specific kind of response and received a different one and doesn't immediately know where to file it. She looked at his badge. "Read it like a notation, Cooper. How long have you been with the building?" 2 years. A pause that wasn't silence, it was preparation. "And in 2 years, you haven't developed a method that doesn't turn the lobby into a hazard on a Monday morning?" The words landed. The ripple was visible, the two employees finally committing to their forward movement. Patricia's typing, resuming with the careful rhythm of someone trying to sound like she hadn't been listening. Darnell Cooper did not tighten his grip on the mop handle. Did not let a single true thing about himself rise to the surface where someone who needed leverage could find it. He looked at Monica Reed, actually looked at her, for the first time in the exchange, and what he saw was not a villain. It was something more complicated and less satisfying than a villain. A person who had become very skilled at maintaining a certain altitude and had confused that altitude with accuracy. He recognized it, not with anger, with something closer to a kind of quiet, tired recognition, the way you recognize a weather pattern you've navigated before. "I'll have the floor dry before your client arrives," he said. "I apologize for the inconvenience." He turned back to the water. He heard her give a clipped instruction to her assistant about a facilities review, and then the precise sound of expensive heels moving away across marble, each step landing with the certainty of someone who had never had serious cause to question the ground beneath them. Darnell kept working. He was aware of Vanessa Carter before she spoke, the different weight of her footsteps. Something younger in the cadence, less rehearsed than the people who'd been performing competence in this building long enough that performing had become the competence. He'd seen her in the building a handful of times. Monica Reed's daughter. Ran strategic development on the 22nd floor. Moved through the building differently than her mother looked at people when she passed them, the actual lateral that most people in a hurry edit out. She'd come out of the elevator near the end of the exchange. He didn't know how much she'd heard. Enough, probably. "Mr. Cooper." She stopped a few feet away, not hovering, just present. He glanced up. "Miss Carter, I saw what just happened." A pause. "I want you to know that shouldn't have. I appreciate that," he said, and meant it, which was why he also meant what came next. "But you don't need to apologize for someone else." She was quiet for a moment. He kept working the water, mostly contained now, the marble starting to show its actual surface again beneath the wet. "That's a very patient answer," she said. "I've had practice." He heard something in the way she asked the next question, a thoughtfulness she wasn't bothering to perform. At patience, or at this specific kind of situation? He glanced up. She was watching him with the focused attention of someone genuinely asking, not constructing a question for the sake of having said something. Both, he said. Though not in that order, he went back to work, and in the motion of turning, of reaching across to redirect the mop angle, his right sleeve pulled back the way sleeves pull when you're working, without ceremony or intention, just fabric following the geometry of the arm beneath it. Didn't notice. Vanessa Carter noticed. It was there for less than 3 seconds. A tattoo, old, the ink carried the quality of something that had been through time. Faded at the edges but intact in its fundamental structure, the way things built to last carry their age without losing their shape. The image was compact and precise, a winged sword, enclosed in a circle of numerals, 3 letters beneath it, NVF. She didn't know what that meant. Not yet. She filed it anyway, the way you file something your brain has decided matters before you've had a chance to verify, why set aside, held, waiting for the context that would tell her what she was holding. She said goodbye. He nodded. She left. He finished the floor. By 10 in the morning, the lobby incident had traveled through Reed Capital Tower's informal communication network, which operated at roughly the speed of a group Etsy message, and significantly exceeded the actual company intranet in both reach and accuracy. Darnell knew this, not because anyone told him, but because he could read a room, and the rooms he moved through for the next 2 hours carried a specific quality, the heightened stillness of people actively not discussing something in front of the person the something was about. He caught fragments. That's all it ever was. Didn't even react, I'm telling you. Just stood there like, if that had been me, I would have. 2 years he's been here, apparently. And he paid it no particular attention. He had learned a long time ago that the conversations happening about you in your absence were never the ones you'd have chosen to be having, and you couldn't control them. You could only control the thing that happened first, what you did when people were watching. He was comfortable with what he'd done. He took his break. At 11, in the staff lounge on the basement level, where the quiet was the specific quiet of a space below the building's primary activity, muffled, functional, without the performance that the upper floors required. He poured coffee from the carafe that existed in a permanent state of being slightly too old to be good and slightly too fresh to justify replacing, sat at the corner table and opened his phone. A message from the care center. Routine check-in. His mother had had a good morning alert, recognized the nurses, had asked whether her son was coming this evening, because she had apparently told Sandra at the front desk that her son was always on time and she wanted to verify the information remained current. He texted back, yes. 6 o'clock. Tell her I'll bring the butter rolls from the bakery on Peachtree. He put the phone down, drank the coffee. Let the quiet do what quiet does when you stop fighting it. It stopped being an absence and started being a presence, something with its own texture and weight, the low hum of the HVAC, the distant muffled pressure of the city several floors above. His own breathing, which he'd been monitoring without intending to for 2 years now, a habit so thoroughly incorporated that it no longer registered as a habit. He thought about his mother's face on the days she knew him. The specific way her expression changed when he walked in, not dramatic, not cinematic, just a door opening behind the eyes. The light coming through in a way that made everything in the room slightly more legible. He thought about the mornings she didn't know him, when he sat with her anyway, because the presence mattered regardless of whether the recognition was there. Miss Garth. He thought about butter rolls and the bakery on Peachtree, and whether they'd have the right ones today, or whether he'd have to get the plain ones and tell her they were the same, which she would absolutely identify as a lie and would graciously pretend to accept. He finished the coffee, stood, went back to work. The West Corridor needed the kind of attention that the morning rush had deferred foot traffic, compressing whatever the overnight crew had missed into the corners. And along the baseboards, the ordinary accumulation of a building that never fully stopped. He worked through it methodically. The cart's wheel pulled left. He adjusted, without thinking about it, the same small correction he'd been making for 6 weeks. Gerald in procurement remained a theoretical figure. The floor got clean. At 12:40, he finished the west corridor and moved toward the utility station to refill. He needed to check the south side before his afternoon break, and the east stairwell on 3 had been smelling more aggressively of someone's lunch than usual, which suggested either a new tenant on 2 or a change in catering schedule for the 4th floor meeting rooms. He was thinking about neither of these things particularly. He was thinking about the bakery and about the parking on Peachtree on Monday afternoons, which was a civic problem without a solution. It was Jeffrey Lewis who changed the trajectory of everything that week. Though nobody knew it yet, including Jeffrey himself. Jeffrey was 58 years old, which put him in the same year as Darnell Cooper, though they'd arrived at that age from roads that had almost nothing in common except the destination. Men who had seen enough to stop being moved by volume, who used the quiet the way other people used momentum. He ran building security with the specific competence of someone who understood that the job was about responding to situations. It was about understanding them early enough that responding never became necessary. He'd been in the army before this. Different branch, different theaters, but the same fundamental training in the thing that threaded through all of it. Context is the only thing that makes content legible. You cannot understand what you're looking at until you know what you're looking at. Full stop. He'd been watching the camera replay for 40 minutes before he allowed himself to form a conclusion. It wasn't the confrontation itself that kept him at the monitor. He'd observed Monica Reed exercise her particular form of authority on several occasions over the years, and each time it had followed the same pattern: decisive, uncomfortable for the receiving party, brief. That was her style. That wasn't what he was watching. He was watching the man on the receiving end. He'd paused the footage on the moment Darnell turned back toward the cart. The turn itself, the quality of it. Then he'd zoomed in. Not on the face, because a face can perform anything given sufficient motivation. He zoomed in on the body, on the specific distribution of weight, and the position of the hands and the angle of the shoulders, because a body under sustained pressure is harder to lie with. The adrenaline chemistry works against you. The micro-adjustments give you away. Darnell's shoulders were level. Not held level, naturally level. The way a structure is plumb when the foundation is properly laid. His weight was correctly distributed. His hands were relaxed on the mop handle, not gripping it for support. Not using it as an anchor against the effort of not reacting, just holding it the way you hold something that belongs in your hand. And when he turned back to the water, his head moved with the specific economy of a person who had assessed a situation, made a decision, and returned to the task at hand with no wasted motion in any direction. Jeffrey had seen that quality of stillness in exactly 3 categories of people across his experience. People who had dedicated decades to contemplative practice. Surgeons deep in a procedure they'd performed so many times it had become a form of moving meditation. And soldiers who had been through enough operational stress that the nervous system had stopped treating high-pressure environments as emergencies and had started treating them as working conditions. He pulled the footage forward, found the moment Darnell reached across to redirect the mop, the extension of the arm, the sleeve riding up. Jeffrey zoomed in, adjusted the contrast, held the image. The tattoo was small on the screen, partially obscured by the angle, but the structure was legible. A winged blade, a ring of numerals around it, and 3 letters that Jeffrey had to lean forward to confirm, because he didn't want to be wrong about this. NVF. He sat back. The chair had a small squeak on the left side that nobody had gotten around to addressing. It registered his movement and offered nothing further. Jeffrey reached for his personal cell, not the office line, the one that wasn't logged. The name he dialed appeared in his contacts under a code that dated back to a friendship formed during a 2003 deployment that neither of them had discussed with anyone outside the people who'd been there. 3 rings. 4. Lewis, The voice was gravel and accumulated miles, the voice of a man who had traveled extensively without it making him any softer. It's Jeffrey. Off the record. I need a name run possible NVF affiliation. Cooper, Darnell. The silence that followed was a different quality than the pause before it. This one had mass. Say that again. Jeffrey said it again, another silence. Then, where'd you see the ink? Security footage. Building I run in Atlanta, Darnell Cooper. He heard something being set down on the other end a cup, or the phone being shifted to a better hand. Lewis. That name comes with a file. A real one. Not a standard dossier. A file with significant redaction. Tell me what you can, what his contact could tell him, in the careful, calibrated language of someone trained to say exactly enough and nothing more. Was this Darnell Cooper, former captain, Nightfall Vanguard Force, a designation that appeared in official documentation with a frequency suggesting deliberate minimization. 22 years of service. An operational record that included mission classifications above Jeffrey's clearance level. A 2017 event, no location specified, no tactical details provided, described in the redacted summary only as a sustained hostile environment with 72 hours of communication blackout. 32 civilians extracted, complete. 2 NVF personnel KIA. He filed his resignation papers approximately 6 months after. The voice continued. Clean separation. No friction in the debrief process. Just filed the paperwork and stopped being there. Why'd he leave? Not in the file, but there's a supplemental notation. Personal care leave. Immediate family member. That's the full text. Jeffrey was quiet for a moment. The commendation. What happened with it? A different kind of pause. He returned it. Through official channels, with a written statement. The unredacted portion indicates he did not believe an individual commendation was an accurate assignment of credit, given the personnel who did not return. Jeffrey Lewis sat in his security office in the basement of Reed Capitol Tower and looked at the frozen image on his monitor, a man in a blue maintenance uniform, kneeling on marble, handling water, and felt the specific weight of something he didn't have a ready name for. It was adjacent to grief but oriented outward rather than inward. Adjacent to anger but moving too slowly to be anger. Closest, maybe, to the particular feeling of realizing you have been walking beside someone carrying something substantial for a long time without once registering the weight. Thank you, he said into the phone. Lewis, the voice quieted. Whatever you're thinking about doing with this, think carefully about whether it's yours to do. I'm thinking about it. Think harder. He ended the call. Looked at the frozen image for another long moment. Darnell Cooper on one knee, not performing anything, not asking anything, just working. Jeffrey pulled up the building's event calendar on his second monitor, found Wednesday. Reed Capitol Government Relations Summit, no, that was the wrong entry. There. Department of Defense Partnership Review. 2 o'clock, 40th floor conference suite. Catered. Full security protocol pre-clearance required. He opened the attendee list. He had access for standard security screening purposes. He read it top to bottom, stopped at the fourth name, General Lorraine Mitchell. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. Jeffrey reached for the phone again. His contact picked up faster this time, as if he'd been expecting the callback. One more thing, Jeffrey said. The 2017 event. Authorization chain on the DoD side. Do you know who signed the mission green at the Special Ops oversight level? Papers or memory? A pause with texture to it. That level, that year, Mitchell. Colonel Lorraine Mitchell at that point. Promoted the following year. Jeffrey said nothing. Lewis? Nothing else. Thank you. He ended the call. Sat with the information until it stopped being data and started being something that required a decision. He pulled up the maintenance scheduling system. Found Wednesday's roster for the 40th floor, the setup and post-lunch cleanup rotation. The gap between 1 o'clock and 1:45 before the DoD team was scheduled to arrive. He looked at the open slot in the coverage column. He moved his cursor to the assignment field, DOIB, the name. Cooper, Darnell, in the memo field he wrote. Experienced staff for pre-event space management. Senior supervisor recommendation. He submitted the change. He didn't know what would happen. He knew what might happen, and he knew that it was not his story to write. It was never his story to write. It was the story of the man on the screen, and the story of the truth sitting, unacknowledged in a building that had no idea what it contained. Sometimes the only honest thing you can do is put the right people in the same suit and trust the truth to handle itself. He closed the scheduling window, looked at the frozen image one more time. Darnell Cooper, doing the work, wearing nothing that told you who he was. Jeffrey Lewis said quietly to the room, "You're owed more than this corridor." The building hummed around him. 2,400 people going about their Monday. None of them knowing what was sitting in the basement, holding a cup of bad coffee, and the beginning of something that wasn't quite a plan but was in the direction of one. Vanessa Carter did not consider herself a person who spiraled. She was strategic by training and by nature, a color-coded calendar, a note system organized by project and sub-project and sub-sub-project, a decision-making habit that involved writing out the two sides of any significant question before committing to either. She had added a third column in her late 20s when she realized that the unknowns were usually where the actual answer lived. She processed. She did not spiral. So what she was doing at 11:43 p.m. on Monday night, sitting on her apartment floor with her laptop open and 3 browser tabs running and a bowl of cereal going soft on the coffee table, was processing. Aggressively. The tattoo had 3 letters. NVF. She'd been certain of that from the moment she saw it, the image already in the part of her brain that retains things before you've decided they're worth retaining. She'd started broad military tattoos, special operations insignia, and had spent 40 minutes in veteran forums and army history discussions that were thorough and detailed and entirely focused on things that were not what she was looking for. She narrowed the search, then narrowed it again. Around 10:30 she typed the 3 letters and a word, Nightfall Vanguard Force, and what came back was so sparse that the sparseness itself was the answer. Because most military units leave records, press releases, retirement ceremony announcements, base newspaper coverage, memorial pages. The ordinary institutional accumulation that comes from an organization existing in the world over time, not because it's trying to be found but because existence leaves traces. NVF had almost none of that. One paragraph in a 2019 academic paper on the evolution of Special Operations Command structures. The paragraph mentioned NVF in past tense, noted its operational period as approximately 2008 to 2020, described its mission set as time-critical civilian protection and extraction in denied access environments, and said nothing further because the citations were redacted. One forum post, from a username with 4 total posts and then silence, ran into a guy at a VFW hall outside Savannah who said he'd served with NVF. Wouldn't say much, just said they went where regular units couldn't, didn't stay long enough to leave a trace. Said the tattoo was the only thing any of them kept. That was the entire public record. Vanessa looked at the ceiling, looked at the cereal, looked at the screen. The man her mother had lectured in the lobby, who had come to work and cleaned up water and cleaned up water, and accepted a public dressing down with the equanimity of someone who had genuinely encountered worse. That man had served in a unit so deliberately minimized that finding 3 sentences about it felt like an archaeological result. She closed the laptop, opened it again, because here was what her 2-column system couldn't quite accommodate. She wasn't angry on Darnell Cooper's behalf in the way she'd expected to be when she came home. She'd expected the anger to be clean, something to call out, to address, to act on. What she actually felt was more uncomfortable than anger. It was closer to shame, the specific kind that doesn't originate in you but lands on you anyway. The way smoke from something burning nearby settles into your clothes without your having lit anything. And underneath that, something quieter. The feeling of having moved through a building for 2 years without seeing one of the people holding it up. Not because she'd been deliberately blind. Because she'd been busy. moving with enough momentum that the people the building depended on had blurred into the category of infrastructure rather than remaining individual humans. That was its own failure. Smaller than what her mother had done. Still a failure, and one she could not root around by noting that it was smaller. She put the laptop away and meant it this time. Lay on the floor with the ceiling above her, which was where she went when the thinking got too circular for furniture to help. The ceiling had a small water stain in the northwest corner, there since she moved in, never growing and never receding, which she had come to think of as reliable in the way of things that simply persist. She thought about what Darnell had said to her. The first thing, you don't need to apologize for someone else, which was correct, and also a careful, deliberate repositioning of what the conversation was allowed to become. And the second, when she'd pushed, I've had practice. At patience, or at this specific kind of situation? Both. Though not in that order, she'd turned that over on the drive home and was still turning it over. Not in that order. Which meant the patience came after something, which meant there was a version of Darnell Cooper that existed before this particular stillness had been the operating mode. And whatever that version had been, whatever had preceded the equanimity, had required a different internal architecture entirely. She was still thinking about that when she fell asleep on the floor, which was not how she'd planned the evening, but was probably the most honest thing she'd done all day. Tuesday arrived, with the ordinary friction of a full building in motion, meetings that started on time and didn't, decisions that waited for information that waited for decisions, the midweek energy of an organization that had gotten through Monday and now had to get through the rest of the week. Vanessa was in meetings from 9 to 12:30. Strategic benchmarking. A Q4 projection discussion that got 40 minutes long because two senior directors could not agree on a market timing assumption, and no one wanted to be the person who said they were both making the same error from different directions. She thought about NVF twice during the Q4 discussion, which probably said something about her current prioritization that she would examine later. She found Jeffrey Lewis at his desk in the security office at 1:15. She'd been expecting him to be harder to read. He wasn't. I need to ask you something about Darnell Cooper, she said, and watched his face do nothing at all, which was more information than most expressions would have been. What do you want to know? I want to know if you know something about him that I don't. He looked at her with the expression of a man performing a calculation that was more ethical than mathematical. What makes you think I know something? Because you're sitting like someone who's been holding a folder and hasn't decided yet whether to open it. Something in his face shifted the suggestion of a smile without the full commitment. You're sharper than your title suggests. My title is Director of Strategic Development. Sharp is in the job description. She leaned forward slightly. Jeffrey, what do you know? What he told her was measured and precise. He told her about the tattoo on the footage, the call he'd made, what the call confirmed and where the confirmed information ended, and what he couldn't share began. He told her about the mission, no location, no tactical specifics, just the shape of it, denied environment, 72 hours without communication, 32 people, 2 losses. He told her the man had declined a formal commendation. She sat with that for a moment. He's been here 2 years. Yes, and he came to work yesterday and let my mother say what she said to him. Knowing what he's done, Jeffrey Lewis looked at her for a long moment. Miss Carter? He said, in the tone of someone who had been waiting for the right moment for a particular thing. Do you know what it means to be a person who has stopped requiring external confirmation of their own worth? She didn't answer immediately. It means, he continued, that what your mother said to him yesterday landed differently than it would have landed on someone still in the process of figuring out what they're worth. He wasn't devastated. He was tired. Those are very different states, and the second one is probably heavier. She rode the elevator back to her floor with that settled somewhere in her chest where it wasn't dislodged by posture or breathing. Tired, not devastated. The distinction mattered in a way she didn't have full language for yet, except that devastation implies a structure that collapsed and tired implies a structure that held and holding had cost something that nobody in the building had been paying attention to. She sat at her desk, did not open her calendar, looked at the Atlanta skyline doing its Tuesday afternoon thing, steady, commercial, indifferent to individual reckonings happening behind the glass. Then she opened the DoD partnership brief for Wednesday and made herself read it. The brief was thorough, and she absorbed almost none of it, because the section of her mind that processed documents was running at reduced capacity, while another section worked on something it hadn't been assigned. Not in that order. She read the brief twice, made notes, set it aside, did not resolve the other thing, because the other thing was not the kind of problem that resolved on a deadline. It was the kind that required you to wait until the information that would clarify it became available. She went back to work. Wednesday was coming, and with it, $847 million in federal contract value, 6 representatives of the Department of Defense, and a maintenance worker who had been assigned to the 40th floor by a scheduling change that Jeffrey Lewis had made for reasons he had not fully explained. Vanessa Carter closed her notebook. Looked at the skyline one more time. Something was in motion. She couldn't see the shape of it yet, but she could feel the weight of it, the way you feel the pressure of weather before the weather arrives, the specific heaviness of something that has been accumulating and is very close now to becoming visible. She left the office at 6:40, took the elevator down, crossed the lobby. Darnell Cooper's cart was gone from the service bay. His shift had ended hours ago. She walked through the doors and into the Atlanta evening, and the city was already well into its night, and the building behind her rose against the darkening sky with its 47 floors of glass and light. And somewhere inside it, in a basement office, Jeffrey Lewis was finishing his end-of-day log and not saying anything to anyone about a scheduling change that he had made, because the truth was sitting in a room where it wasn't being seen, and he had decided quietly, without announcement, at the risk of possibly significant professional consequences, to put it somewhere it might be. Wednesday arrived with the specific energy of a day that had been over-prepared for. It was present in the upper floors before 7 a.m. in the particular way. The 40th floor conference suite had been reset overnight. Chairs aligned to the millimeter, the presentation screen tested and retested, the catering layout approved, and then adjusted, and then approved again. It was present in the way. Monica Reed's car was already in the executive garage when the first early arrivals reached their desks at 8, and in the message Patricia had received at 7:42, asking for the revised capability deck, the revised version of the revised capability deck, and confirmation that every prior version had been scrubbed from the shared drives so that version 1.3 did not end up in front of people with federal authority and long institutional memories. Patricia had relayed all of this to her friend in accounts, receivable not through any memo or system, but through the simple human mechanism of needing to say it to someone. And what she'd said was that working for Monica Reed was like being the ground crew for an aircraft flown by the world's most capable pilot. You were never quite certain whether to be proud or afraid, and the answer was usually both at once and in equal measure. Monica was running on preparation and the specific adrenaline of someone who had built something real, and was now required to prove it to people who held authority over whether it would be recognized as real. She was good at this. She had been good at it since before the building had her name on it. Back when the proof of concept was a 17-page pitch deck and a conference room in a shared workspace where the good coffee cost extra, and she'd bought it anyway because the details mattered, and they always had. She had sat across from rooms full of skeptical people and changed their minds repeatedly through the force of being right and knowing how to demonstrate it. She was prepared. She had reviewed every element of the presentation 3 times in the past 14 hours. She had not thought about Darnell Cooper since Monday evening, or more precisely, she had thought about him once, briefly, on Tuesday morning, in the way that something surfaces between thoughts before you've identified it and classified it, a flash of the lobby and the water, and the look on his face that she had filed in a holding pattern because she had a meeting to prepare for. And the holding pattern was functioning adequately. She'd set it aside. The meeting was the priority. The meeting had always been the priority. By 1:15, the suite was confirmed ready. Catering cleared, audio and display tested. She stood at the head of the conference table and ran through the opening section in her head. Not the words. She had the words, but the rhythm of them. The points where you pause and let something settle into the room, and the points where you maintain momentum, because momentum is its own form of argument and sometimes more persuasive than the content it carries. The far door opened. She looked up expecting a facilities check on the water service. What came through the door was a maintenance cart with a front wheel that pulled slightly left, followed by the man who had been compensating for that wheel for 6 weeks, without anyone authorizing its replacement. Darnell Cooper moved into the suite with the unremarkable efficiency of someone executing a defined task in a defined space. He didn't look at the presentation setup. He didn't look at her. He moved directly to the far corner, where something had apparently been left behind. She hadn't been informed what, and didn't ask, and began retrieving it with the same compact economy she'd observed in the lobby 2 days ago. The social architecture of the moment seemed to suggest an acknowledgement. 2 people in a room, a recent exchange between them that hadn't been addressed. The ordinary expectation that adults in proximity will at minimum register each other's existence. She turned back to her notes. He worked in the far corner. She stood at the head of the table. The suite was large enough that the distance between them was substantial, and the silence was technically neutral, and she was not going to assign meaning to the presence of a maintenance worker doing his job in a room she happened to be standing in. He finished whatever he'd come to retrieve, moved toward the side door, and in the specific geometry of maneuvering a cart through a doorway, bending slightly, extending his right arm to manage the angle his sleeve rode up. She saw it. Not long enough to read the letters. Long enough to register the structure. Intentional, contained, the kind of image chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with decoration. The door closed. Monica Reed stood at the head of her conference table, with a presentation she knew from first word to last, and a feeling doing something inconvenient in the region of her sternum, not guilt, not quite, something that hadn't fully identified itself yet, and was using the physical location as a placeholder while it waited for the right category to open up. She looked back at her notes. The words were there. She knew them. For approximately 40 seconds, she couldn't access them. Then she could. She straightened. The Diod team was arriving in 43 minutes, and she had not built what she'd built by letting 40-second interruptions compound into longer ones. She went back to the presentation. The rhythm returned within a minute, the professional override engaging the way it always did when the work was real and the preparation had been thorough. She went back to work. General Lorraine Mitchell arrived at 1:58 with 6 people. She was 62 years old and moved through spaces the way people move when they've spent decades in rooms, where how you enter is the first test, and they've passed it enough times that they've stopped thinking about it. Silver hair, close-cut and natural, maintained with the pragmatism that appeared to govern most of her visible choices. She was in civilian clothes department protocol for certain categories of partnership discussions, where the signaling of uniform rank complicates the dynamics of a conversation that needs to operate as a negotiation between equals. She wore the civilian clothes the way someone wears clothes, when the clothes are borrowed, present, appropriate, not the source of anything. She was striking in the way that authority carried long enough becomes a physical quality, not beauty exactly. Though the structure of her face was good, but something that functioned like beauty in that it drew and held attention without requiring effort to do so. The attention she drew was of a specific kind. The attention you give to someone you've decided is worth being careful around, not out of fear but out of recognition that they will notice things you might prefer they didn't. Monica received the group at the suite entrance. The handshakes were decisive. The introductions were efficient, 6 names and roles, committed to Monica's memory immediately, processed by Lorraine's team with the varying retention of people at different stages of a long day. They settled. Monica began. She was 9 minutes in past the market context section, into the capability architecture, hitting her pace in the way she always hit her pace. Around minute 8 or 9 when the formality had metabolized, and the room had relaxed into the actual substance of what they were there to discuss when the side door opened, not dramatically. The particular quality of opening that belongs to someone trying not to interrupt, trying to complete a task with minimum disruption, entering the way service personnel enter rooms in the middle of meetings because the meeting schedule and the maintenance schedule don't always consult each other. General Lorraine Mitchell stopped mid-sentence. She had been making a point about DoD integration requirements, building on something Monica had said, the back and forth of a meeting, finding its productive register, and she stopped with the absolute precision of a woman who did not stop in the middle of sentences without cause that she considered sufficient. She was looking at the far side of the room, at Darnell Cooper. Bent over the lower rack of his cart, his right arm extended, the tattoo fully visible in the direct overhead lighting of the suite. The room registered it before it understood it. That specific quality of collective attention shifting, sick people noticing that the person they worked for had become very still and recalibrating in response, because that stillness in her meant something was requiring her full engagement. Lorraine Mitchell pushed her chair back. Stood, not quickly, not slowly. The way a person stands when they've arrived at a certainty, and the standing is the statement of it. She crossed toward the far side of the room. Darnell was already turning his peripheral awareness, had registered the movement, had tracked it, and assessed it with the latency of someone whose peripheral awareness had been professionally developed over 2 decades of environments, where what you didn't see in your periphery could cost more than attention. He straightened, turned fully, looked at her, 1 beat. 2. Darnell Cooper. Her voice was quiet, specific, the kind of quiet that carries precisely because it doesn't compete with anything. He looked at her. 1 second, maybe 2, with something behind his eyes that wasn't performance, and wasn't surprise recognition, and with it something heavier that the room couldn't name because it didn't have the context. General Mitchell. Something passed between them that the room could feel without being able to read the specific gravity of 2 people whose last shared experience had been something the room didn't have access to, and whose presence in the same space now carried the full weight of the distance. Between then and this moment, Lorraine turned to face the room. Her team had risen, not the formal mechanics of military attention, but the functional equivalent that develops in people who work closely enough with someone to read, when the moment requires them to stop being individuals and become witnesses. She spoke for 4 minutes without notes and without preamble. She told the room about a 2017 civilian protection operation in a denied access environment, one she was authorized to discuss in general terms. She described a 72-hour communication blackout, 32 civilians, in a deteriorating situation. A unit that went in without updated intelligence, without external support, without confirmation that any element of the plan would hold under the conditions they actually found. She told them about the commanding officer who made decisions in that window based on training and judgment, and the specific acceptance of being the person whose call it was when no one else could be reached. She told them that 32 civilians came home, that 2 members of the unit did not, that the commanding officer declined the commendation that followed, in writing, citing his belief that an individual honor was an inaccurate assignment of credit given the men who had not returned. She turned back to look at Darnell, Captain Cooper, the old rank, carrying what it had always carried, intact, waiting in storage since the day he'd stopped using it. I never said this to you directly. What you did in those 72 hours is the reason 5 members of my staff are alive today. I've owed you that sentence for 7 years. The room was very quiet. Not silent silence is the absence of sound. And this was the presence of something that had weight and temperature and the specific quality of something true being said in public, in front of people who would remember it. That's a different thing from silence. That's a room changed. Darnell stood with his hand resting on the side of the cart. He looked at Lorraine Mitchell with the same measured steadiness that had characterized every exchange he'd had in this building for 2 years. And he said, "You don't owe me anything, General." "We all did what the job required," she nodded once. Slowly, the expression of someone who respects an answer and disagrees with it completely, but recognizes that arguing it is not the right use of this moment. Monica Reed was standing at the head of her conference table. She had a presentation on the screen behind her. She had 7 people in this room, 6 of them now oriented toward the 8th, toward the maintenance worker in the blue uniform, who was being addressed by a general of the United States military, with the specific gravity of a debt being publicly acknowledged. She had $847 million in potential contract value present in this suite, and the meeting that was supposed to secure a path toward it had been suspended by a moment she had not arranged and could not have anticipated, and had no mechanism for managing. She was looking at Darnell Cooper, not at the uniform, not at the cart, not at the supply item he'd come to retrieve from the corner of her conference suite. At him, at the specific geometry of the man she'd addressed in her lobby on Monday morning, as though his worth could be established from his badge number. And she was experiencing with sudden and unwelcome precision the distance between what she had seen and what had been there to see. He looked at her, just briefly. Just long enough for it to be a real exchange, rather than an accidental crossing of sight lines. And what was in it was not triumph. Not the vindication of a man whose standing has been publicly established. What was in it was something quieter, and considerably harder to receive the simple, unadorned acknowledgement of one person looking at another person. 2 humans in a room. The most basic transaction available, and the one that had been missing from their interaction 2 days ago. He inclined his head, small and precise, the way you close a door you've been holding open not with force, just by releasing it and letting it go. He moved toward the side exit. Monica found her voice. "Mr. Cooper." He stopped, half a turn. The patience of a man who would give her the moment if she needed it, but wasn't going to perform anticipation of what it would contain. She had prepared for this meeting for 72 hours. She had 17 years of experience in rooms with this level of stakes. She stood at the head of her own conference table and could not locate a sentence. What came out was, "I need to speak with you." After this meeting, he looked at her for 1 second. 2. "I'll be in the building until 2, he said. And then he went through the door and it closed behind him, and the suite settled into a quiet that lasted several full seconds before anyone moved to fill it. Lorraine Mitchell returned to her seat, opened her portfolio. "I apologize for the interruption, Miss Reed." Her voice was entirely level. "You were on slide 9, I believe." Monica looked at the screen. Slide 9. The carefully constructed capability argument she'd spent 3 days refining. "I was," she said. She picked up where she'd stopped. Her voice was steady within 30 seconds. The professional override engaging the way it always did when the preparation was solid, and the work was real, and the stakes justified the focus. She moved through the material. See, the room followed. But something had shifted in how Lorraine's team was listening, a slight change in the register of their attention, as though they were now processing the presentation through an additional layer of evaluation. Not just the capability case, the person making it. The kind of assessment that has nothing to do with slides, and everything to do with whether the person across the table is someone they want to be in a long-term institutional relationship with. Monica felt it. She kept going. The meeting ran until 4:15. Lorraine requested a 1-week extension for technical review standard language. Professionally delivered, non-committal in the way that a delay requested by someone in her position is always non-committal, because it could mean several things and only one of them was favorable. Monica accepted with the composure of someone who had been in enough of these. to know that the extension was not a refusal, and that the handshakes at the end were warmer than the ones at the beginning, and that Lorraine's hand in hers at the door came with a look that communicated something that didn't fit into the professional register of the exchange, but was present and unmistakable. The room emptied. Vanessa had been in the back of the suite for the last 90 minutes as a secondary stakeholder, taking notes on her tablet and watching the room with the divided attention of someone managing two simultaneous assessments. She stayed after the last of the DOD team cleared the hallway. Looked at her mother across the length of the table. Monica was looking at the side door. "Mom?" Monica turned. Her face was doing something Vanessa hadn't seen it do in a long time. Nothing, specifically. Not the controlled nothing of performance, but the genuine blankness of a person who has just processed something that hasn't finished processing and hasn't yet decided what to do with the parts. "I didn't know," Monica said. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She heard it, did not attempt to correct it. Vanessa didn't fill the space. She had learned, over years of being this woman's daughter, that Monica's moments of genuine reckoning were rare and fragile and required room rather than assistance. "That's not what bothers me," Monica said after a moment. "Not knowing. I couldn't have known that specifically. No, what bothers me," she stopped, looked at the table, at the presentation screen behind her, now dark, at the room that had held 7 people and $847 million in federal attention, and one unexpected moment of clarity that had not been in any version of the agenda. "What bothers me is that it would have been exactly the same if I had known." Vanessa looked at her mother. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Monica pulled out a chair and sat down for the first time in 8 hours. "If someone had told me on Monday morning, specifically, every mission, every detail, every citation in that file," she looked at her hands on the table. "I'm not certain it would have changed what I said to him. The room held that, because it would have meant I respected him for what he'd done," she said. "Not for what he was. And that's," she stopped. "That's the same problem, approached from the other direction." Vanessa sat across from her. She didn't have a 2-column analysis for this. She just had her mother sitting at the head of an empty conference table, looking directly at something most people spend significant energy not looking at. "He said he'd be in the building until 2, Vanessa said. Monica looked at her watch. 2:04. She stood up. "Jeffrey knows where he parks," Vanessa said. Monica was already moving toward the door. She paused. "What do you know about what Jeffrey did?" "Some of it. Tell me the rest when I get back." She was in the elevator going down before Vanessa could respond. The building's shift log, which Monica had pulled on her phone in the elevator, showed Darnell Cooper clocked out at 2:04. The service lot was 2 levels below the main garage. She went 2 levels below the main garage. The service lot had the particular quality of a space designed for function rather than experience concrete, fluorescent, the residual smell of exhaust and cleaning products, and the specific temperature of underground spaces that don't change with the season. Her heels on the concrete floor, the ambient hum of the ventilation system. 2 levels down, the maintenance vehicles parked in designated rows. His truck was still there. He was beside it, jacket over the uniform shirt, keys in his hand, doing the thing people do in parking lots when they've finished one part of the day and are making the transition to the next present in the body, already partly in the direction of wherever comes next. He heard her footsteps. Turned. She was 10 feet away in a suit that had cost more than his monthly rent, and she had no idea how to begin this conversation, which was a genuinely new experience, and felt, under the circumstances, entirely appropriate. "You said 2 o'clock, she said. He looked at her. "You're 4 minutes early, not late. Early." She registered that and filed it without comment. "I wanted to catch you before you left. I'm here." She had prepared nothing for this. The recognition that preparation would be the wrong tool had arrived even as she said it to him in the conference suite. Preparation was for arguments she needed to win, and this was not an argument, and she was not interested in winning it. She was interested in something else, something that didn't have a clean professional name. "I owe you an apology," she said. No preamble, no softening qualifications. "What I said to you on Monday was wrong. Not because of who you are or what you've done, because it was wrong to say to any person, including the 11 other people in this building. I have never acknowledged as anything other than their function." Darnell looked at her with the steadiness she'd been unable to categorize on Monday and still couldn't fully categorize now. He wasn't receiving the apology the way apologies are usually received. The slight forward lean, the readiness to say, "It's fine." The social reflex of relieving the person apologizing of their discomfort. He was standing there, listening, with the quality of someone who understood that the words needed to be heard before they could be responded to, and that hearing and responding were separate acts that couldn't be compressed into one. "Do you want to know why I didn't react on Monday?" he said. She hadn't expected that to be the response. "Yes, because I've been spoken to that way before," he said. "Not by people who meant harm, by people under pressure who ran out of better ways to feel in control of something. I learned a long time ago that the reaction those moments are fishing for isn't the reaction worth giving." She held eye contact. It required more than she'd anticipated. "The thing that bothered me," he continued, "wasn't what you said. It was the assumption underneath it. The assumption that what I was holding told you what I was worth." A pause, the ordinary pause of someone saying a true thing carefully, taking the time to say it right. "I've held a lot of different things. The worth was the same across all of them." Monica Reed was quiet. The service lot was quiet around them, concrete and fluorescent light and distance, and the low hum of the ventilation doing its function. "You're right," she said. And then, because she had meant what she'd said in the conference suite about not operating from the wrong premise, "I'm not saying that because of what I learned about you today. I'm saying it because you would have been right even if nothing today had happened. Even if you were exactly what I assumed you were on Monday morning." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not a smile, but the region adjacent to one. The particular region where a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time allows themselves, briefly, the consideration of setting it down. "That's a better apology than most people get around to," he said. "I've had practice," she said, and heard the echo of what he'd said to her daughter 2 days ago, and from the slight adjustment in his expression, he'd heard it too. The service lot held them for a moment. Two people in the functional middle space between what they had been to each other before this and whatever came after it, neither of which had a name yet. "I need to get to Peachtree before 5:30, he said. She didn't know why she knew the bakery closed at 5:30. She knew it. Filed it in the column of things that didn't yet have a category. "Butter rolls," she said. "For my mother," she nodded once. Stepped back. Gave him the path. He got into the truck. She watched the taillights appear and move and disappear around the ramp curve, the red, briefly vivid in the concrete dark, and then gone. She stood in the service lot for another 30 seconds. Alone in the functional quiet of a space that held the particular weight of a conversation she hadn't planned, hadn't controlled, hadn't won, and that felt more honest than most of what she'd said in this building in a very long time. Then she went back upstairs. The 40th floor was empty when she returned to it. The conference suite had been cleared by the catering team's chairs back to neutral positions. The surface of the table clean and reflective. The presentation screen dark. The room that had held a DoDed partnership review and an unexpected reckoning was just a room again, waiting to be configured for whatever came next. Monica stood at the head of the table for a moment. She didn't have a reason to be standing here specifically, except that it was where she'd been when the afternoon changed, and there was something she was still working out, and this was the room where the working out had started. She thought about what it cost a person to hold what Darnell Cooper held and still show up. To have done what he'd done and be standing in a building that didn't know his name and to keep showing up anyway, because the alternative was to not show up, and he was not someone who didn't show up. She thought about what that quality cost over time, sustained without acknowledgement, The compound interest of invisibility. She pulled out her phone, opened a text to Patricia. Shows me the complete staff list for building maintenance and facilities. All 11, names, roles, years of service. Tonight if you can. She looked at the dark presentation screen, at the room that was just a room. At the side door through which Darnell Cooper had left, unhurried, taking his cart, going back to work the way he went back to work every day. She thought about her mother, about a cleaning business built with a van and 3 industrial machines, and a client list grown through reliability and quality, and a phone answered personally because there was no one else to answer it. She had spent years being grateful for what that business had eventually enabled, without once thinking about what it had required. She had not thought about the weight of it, she had thought about the outcome. She was thinking about the weight now. Patricia's response came 8 minutes later. List attached. Complete. 11 names. I've worked here 3 years and I didn't know all of them either, for the record. Monica read the list. All 11 names. She went through them twice, committing each one, the way she'd committed the 6 names of the DoD team 2 hours ago in a handshake line at the door. It took less time than she'd expected. 11 names. It turned out that 11 names, when you were actually paying attention, was not a large number. She stayed in the suite for another few minutes, not doing anything in particular. Just present, in the room where the afternoon had changed, with the list of 11 names in her phone and the weight of the week settling into its proper configuration. Vanessa was waiting for her in the hallway outside. How did it go? Vanessa asked. He said it was a better apology than most people manage. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Was it? I think so. I hope so. Monica looked at her daughter. Tell me what you know about what Jeffrey did, Vanessa told her. All of it, the footage, the phone calls, the scheduling change, the calculated risk of a man who decided the truth was sitting in a room where it wasn't being seen, and that he could put it somewhere it might be, at potential professional cost to himself, without telling anyone what he was doing or why. Monica listened, the way she'd listened to Darnell in the service lot fully, without composing a response in the space the words were still occupying. When Vanessa finished, Monica was quiet for a long moment. He could have come to me directly, she said. Jeffrey. He could have walked into my office and told me. He could have, Vanessa said. He didn't think it was his story to tell. Monica absorbed that, and Darnell knew she'd be there. Saw the name on the setup sheet. Said nothing, yes, because it wasn't his story to tell either. I think that's right. Monica looked at the closed door of the conference suite, at the hallway, at her daughter who had known something was wrong on Monday morning and had been trying to say so ever since, in the careful way of someone who knows that a person has to arrive at their own reckonings on their own schedule. The program, Monica said. Vanessa looked at her. What program? I'm going to build something. Veteran reintegration support, employment placement, transition counseling, professional development. I have the capital and the infrastructure. What I don't have is the knowledge of what the transition actually requires from the inside. She looked at Vanessa. I'm going to ask him to help design it. If he's willing, that's not a gesture? No, Monica said it with the flatness of someone who had been thinking about the distinction. A gesture is something you do, so you can say you did it. This is something that needs to exist and that I'm positioned to build if I build it correctly. The difference matters. Vanessa nodded slowly. He'll tell you if you're building it wrong, I know. Monica almost smiled. That's actually part of why I want him involved. They walked toward the elevator bank together. The building was quieting into its evening mode, the daytime energy receding, the skeleton crew of the after hours settling in, the particular atmospheric shift of a large space transitioning from full occupancy to essential occupancy. Monica pressed the button for the lobby. There's one more thing, she said. Vanessa waited. The contract, Mitchell's extension. I want you to draft the technical response for the review period, take whatever she needs from the capability deck and build it into a supplementary document. Thorough. No gaps. She paused. And I want it to be good. Not just technically adequate. Actually good. It'll be good, Vanessa said. I know it will. The elevator arrived. They stepped in. That's not why I said it. Vanessa looked at her. I said it because today reminded me that the work matters, Monica said. The actual work, not just the outcome. The quality of what we make. The elevator doors closed. I'd like to not forget that again. The building moved around them, descending, 47 floors of glass and ambition, carrying its 2,400 people. And everything those people were and weren't, known and unknown, seen and not yet seen, through the ordinary machinery of a Wednesday evening in Atlanta. Outside, the city was already in its after-work configuration, the commute to traffic building on Peachtree, the light going amber at the angle of late afternoon, the restaurants filling in the street-level spaces between the towers. Somewhere in that traffic, Darnell Cooper was calculating the parking situation outside a bakery on Peachtree and making a risk assessment about a loading zone and the probability that the right butter rolls were still in the case. He was, most likely, going to be fine. The care center on Briarwood was not a sad place. Darnell had braced for it to be. During the 3 weeks he'd spent visiting facilities with a clipboard and a checklist, and the specific dread of someone making a decision they couldn't unmake. He'd visited 6 places. 2 were sad in the ordinary way, underfunded, understaffed, the particular institutional weariness of a place running on less than it needed. 1 was sad in a different way, the worse way, the way of a place that had stopped registering its own sadness, where the staff moved through routines so thoroughly automated that the people inside the routines had become scenery. He'd left that one after 11 minutes. Briarwood had light, wide windows that tracked the sun through the day. Plants that were real he'd checked, because the fake ones told you something about how the facility thought about its residents, and a staff who called people by name without checking the chart first, which had become his primary test by the 3rd facility visit, applied without announcement to everyone after. He pulled into the parking lot at 6:12, 18 minutes late. The bakery on Peachtree had come through butter rolls, the right ones, still holding warmth in the paper bag on the passenger seat. The parking situation outside the bakery had been exactly as hostile as his prior experience suggested it would be. He'd circled twice, identified a spot that technically required a residential permit, weighed the variables, and committed to the rolls. Sandra was at the front desk evening shift. 2 braids tonight, where Tuesday had been 4. And he made a mental note that his mother would notice the change and have thoughts about it. Because his mother noticed changes in the people around her and had thoughts about most things, Sandra looked up before he reached the desk. Good day. She asked about you at 4 o'clock. I told her you'd be here at 6, and she said she knew, because you're always on time. A pause. I didn't mention the 6 o'clock part to her twice. He processed the gap between his stated arrival and his actual arrival, and decided not to file a report on it. How was she otherwise? Clear most of the afternoon. Ate well. Had opinions about the evening news, which we consider a positive indicator. Sandra smiled in the way of someone who had worked with people long enough to find genuine warmth in the small victories. Room 4. Same as always. He walked the hallway the way he walked every space he knew well, not navigating it, just moving through it. The geography absorbed into his body so thoroughly that it had stopped being geography and become something closer to memory. The smell of it, clean and faintly medicinal, and underneath that something warmer. The irreducible quality of a place where people actually lived rather than just occupied space. The particular squeak of the floor near room 2 that he had flagged to the maintenance coordinator 3 months ago, and that had not been addressed, which he'd stopped mentioning because the squeak had become a landmark, a way of knowing he was close. His mother was at the window, not looking at the glass itself, at the reflection the room's light made of her in the darkened pane. She did this sometimes, on good days and bad ones, and he had learned not to try to read the day from the postures, alone. She heard him at the door, turned, the door behind her eyes opened clean and immediate, the specific quality of recognition that he had learned not to take for granted because it was not guaranteed, and because the days when it wasn't there had taught him what it was worth. It was the same thing her face had done his whole life when he came home, from school, from training, from places he hadn't been permitted to name, that she had worried about regardless, because mothers operated on an intelligence that didn't require information. "You're late," she said, observational, not accusatory, with a small lift at the corner of her mouth that carried the weight of a full smile. He held up the paper bag. "The parking situation on Peachtree is worse than I've been representing it to you." "Sit down," she said. "You can explain the parking to me after you sit down." He sat in the chair that had taken on his geometry over 2 years of visits. The particular way he settled into it had left its impression in the cushion, which he found either comforting or unsettling depending on the day. She reached into the bag without ceremony and took a roll, tore a piece from it with her thumb and forefinger, ate it from her palm, slowly, the way she'd eaten them his whole life, as though savoring was a practice that required deliberate physical architecture. He watched her do this and felt something in his chest settle that spent most of the day not being settled. She told him about Sandra's braids. The Tuesday ones had been better, in her opinion, though she respected the creative decision. She told him about the man in room 7 who'd been singing in the common room after lunch, not skillfully but with genuine investment, which she found more interesting than skill. She told him the news had been upsetting, and she'd decided not to discuss it, but wanted him to know she was paying attention, which she felt was important regardless of what you did with the information. "You've always paid attention," he said. "It's your most inconvenient quality." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been the mother of this specific person for 58 years and found the arrangement, on balance, worth the investment. "Tell me about your day." He considered the question the way he'd learned to consider her questioned considerations, with actual consideration, not the compression he'd defaulted to for years, when there were things he couldn't tell her, and brevity had become a habit that outlasted its necessity. "Something happened at work that I didn't expect," he said. "Good unexpected or bad unexpected?" He thought about the conference suite, about Lorraine Mitchell crossing a room, about Monica Reed in the concrete quiet of the service lot, saying something that had landed where it aimed, the kind that takes time to sort itself into one category or the other. His mother looked at him the way she'd always looked at him when she was reading the parts he wasn't offering, directly. "Were you seen today?" she asked. Simple sentence, the weight of it entirely out of proportion to its length. He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She nodded, ate another piece of the roll from her palm. "Good," she said. "That matters. Being seen matters." Even when you'd rather not need it to, he stayed until 8:15. Later than usual because she was clear and the conversation had the quality it had on the best evenings, unhurried, without the careful navigation around the gaps. Two people who knew each other well enough that the tangents were as comfortable as the direct lines. She fell asleep in the chair before he left, the gradual softening of someone returning to a place that required less from them than wakefulness did. He took the blanket from the foot of the bed and laid it across her lap, with the attention he brought to every small thing that was, in the actual accounting of what mattered, not small. He drove home with the windows down. The Atlanta night was warm, and the city outside sounded like itself, the layered noise of several million people finishing their Wednesday, the particular quality of a weeknight that had been more than it announced at the start. Thursday morning arrived the way Thursdays do, with the surface appearance of ordinary, and underneath it the specific hum of an organization that has processed something collectively and has not yet decided what to do with it. Darnell felt it in the building the way he felt most things in the building, through the texture of how people moved around him, the minor variations in the ambient social field that registered the way weather registers to someone who has spent enough time outdoors to stop enough eating a fork. People said good morning. More of them than usual. Not all of them. The building's default mode was still the default mode, most of its 2,400 people moving through their day, through their day with the particular tunnel vision of people who have things to accomplish and limited peripheral attention. But there were three, on Thursday morning, who stopped, who said his name, who looked at him in the way of people who know something and are deciding whether acknowledging that they know it would be welcome or intrusive, and who landed, each of them, on a version of just good morning that carried more weight than it usually would. He said good morning back. Kept working. The West Corridor had accumulated the residue of a catering event the previous afternoon that the evening crew had addressed incompletely foot traffic patterns, and particular way people move when they're carrying food meant the corners and the stretch near the service alcove needed attention that the broad pass hadn't reached. He reached it now. The cart's left wheel still pulled. He still adjusted. Gerald in procurement remained a theoretical figure. The floor required the same quality of attention it had required yesterday. Jeffrey Lewis appeared in the service corridor at 9:30. Jeffrey did not drop by. He had a circuit, protocols, a base of operations, and specific conditions under which he varied any of those things. His appearing in the service corridor, near the utility station, on a Thursday morning at 9:30 was a variation. Darnell registered it as one. He was carrying 2 coffees from the atrium cart, the good cart, the one that operated on different economics than the staff lounge situation. He held one out with the directness of a person who has made a decision and is not going to spend any energy performing uncertainty about it. Darnell took it. Morning. Morning. Jeffrey settled against the corridor wall with the ease of a man comfortable in spaces that other people move through without stopping. They stood in a quiet that was companionable rather than loaded the quiet of 2 people with shared context who don't need to perform the establishing of it. I owe you a conversation, Jeffrey said. About the schedule change. About the schedule change. Darnell drank the coffee. It was significantly better than the staff lounge option, and he made a mental note about the institutional equity of that gap that he would probably not do anything with, but that was worth noting. You didn't owe me anything, he said. I know I didn't owe it to you. Jeffrey looked at the middle distance, the way people look at things they've thought about enough to know the edges of. I thought the truth was in a room where it wasn't being seen. I thought I could put it somewhere it might be. You couldn't have known what would happen, no. But I had a reasonable hypothesis. Darnell looked at him. It could have gone differently. Yes. If Mitchell hadn't been on the list, then it would have gone differently, Jeffrey said. And I would have been a man who changed a name on a maintenance schedule. For reasons that produced nothing visible. I was prepared to be that man. Darnell held the coffee with both hands and looked at Jeffrey Lewis for a moment with the specific quality of attention he gave to things that warranted consideration rather than just processing. Why, he said, not hostile, actually asking. Jeffrey was quiet for a moment, the pause of someone who has thought about a question enough to know that the real answer is underneath the available answers, and takes more care to reach. Because I spent 20 years in a system that sorted people by rank and function, and watched it get that sorting wrong. Often enough to understand that the sorting was always approximate, he said, and sometimes actively backward. He met Darnell's eyes. And because you've been in this building for 2 years doing good work and giving no one a reason to look twice. And I looked twice, and what I found was, he paused, more than this corridor deserves to contain. Something. In those words required a beat before response, not because they were difficult to receive, but because they were true, and true things arriving from unexpected directions needed a moment to orient correctly. I chose this corridor, Darnell said finally. I want to be clear about that. I know you did. I'm not here because I have nowhere else to be. I know that too. Jeffrey looked at him directly. I wasn't trying to rescue you. I was trying to make sure the record was accurate. There's a real difference between those two things. Darnell considered that distinction for long enough to recognize it as genuine. There is, he said. They finished their coffees. Jeffrey set his cup on the supply shelf to take to the recycling on his way out. The wheel on that cart still pulling left? 6 weeks. Gerald? Gerald, Darnell agreed. Jeffrey left to run his 9:30 circuit. Darnell went back to the west corridor. The building continued its Thursday. It was Patricia who found him at 11:15, on the service level near the utility room. She had come down personally, not a message through the system, not a note through facilities coordination. She had walked to the elevator, pressed B1, and found him herself. Which was the kind of thing people do when they've been asked to deliver a message that requires a human being rather than a notification. "Ms. Reed would like to see you today," she said. "In her office," she said. Patricia paused with expression of someone quoting accurately because the specific words had been specified as important. She said to tell you that at your convenience means actually at your convenience. Not at her convenience with your name on it. He looked at Patricia. She had been the front-of-house presence of this building for 3 years, and her face defaulted to professional in the same way. Good furniture defaults to functional reliably, without effort, but was capable of considerable range when professional wasn't the right register. Right now her face was doing something in the vicinity of, "That's what she said, and I am relaying it faithfully, and also I find this entire development genuinely interesting." "Tell her I'll come up after my noon break," he said. Patricia nodded. "I'll tell her exactly that." She turned to go, then turned back. She was on the 40th floor until almost 7 last night, for what it's worth. Didn't ask for anything from the kitchen. Just worked. He didn't ask what she'd been working on. He had a reasonable hypothesis. He spent the morning with the part of his attention that wasn't on the floor running a background process on the conversation coming that was said. Not rehearsing it, because you couldn't rehearse a conversation. You didn't have the other side of, but taking its measure, the way you take the measure of a situation before you enter it. Not to control it, but to understand what you were walking into. He thought about Monica Reed's apology in the service lot. The specific quality of it, the part that had surprised him, which was not the apology itself, but the ground it stood on. She had said, "I'm not saying this because of who you are. I'm saying it because you would have been right even if you were exactly what I thought you were on Monday morning." He had thought about that on the drive home Wednesday night. It was the harder thing to say. The easier version located the error in what she hadn't known. The version she'd given located it in something more central, more structural, more honest. That version required her to look at something most people spent considerable energy not looking at. He didn't know yet what it changed. But he knew it was real, and real things counted differently than performed ones. He took his noon break. Ate the sandwich he'd made at 6 a.m. from last night's leftovers, objectively adequate, subjectively uninspired. A category of lunch he'd been eating 3 times a week for 2 years, because the time before work was divided between the care center and the commute. And the preparing and inspiring lunches were an optimization he hadn't gotten to yet. He went upstairs at 12:50. Monica Reed's office occupied the northeast corner of the 41st floor. On a clear day, the view laid the Atlanta skyline out like an argument for what ambition could produce when it had the right conditions. Today there was a high, thin overcast doing something non-committal with the light, softening the hard edges of the buildings into something less declarative. The view was still the view. She was standing when he came in, not behind the desk away from it, in the seating area, the 2 chairs angled toward each other, with a low table between them. She had made a specific choice about where to be in the room when he arrived, and the choice said something she hadn't said out loud. She had decided not to receive him from behind the desk of a woman who ran a $40 billion organization, because that desk created a dynamic she wasn't interested in creating for this conversation. He registered that. Filed it. "Thank you for coming up," she said. Patricia said, "At my convenience. I meant that. I know." "It's why I came," she gestured toward the chairs. He sat. She sat across from him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the quiet was the functional kind, the kind that precedes something, rather than being itself the point. "I've been trying to work out how to have this conversation since Wednesday evening," she said. "What conversation are you trying to have?" "An honest one," She looked at him with the directness that appeared to be her default register. The quality that probably made her very effective in rooms where directness was currency, and very difficult in rooms where it wasn't. I told you in the garage that my apology wasn't contingent on who you are. I meant that. But I also want to understand something, and I don't know if I have standing to ask. He waited. You knew she'd be here, she said. General Mitchell. You saw the attendee sheet. Yes, you said nothing. No. Why? He considered it the way he considered questions that deserved real answers rather than available ones. Because it wasn't my story to tell, he said. I've been in this building for 2 years without needing anyone to know what I did before it. The fact that someone from that life was going to walk through the door didn't change my thinking about whether to announce myself. What was your thinking? That my value here isn't borrowed from what I did there. If it were, I'd have mentioned it on day 1. He looked at her steadily. The first week I worked here, 3 people in this building learned my name. Patricia at the front desk, Jeffrey, and the woman in facilities who handles supply requisitions, whose name is Sandra. I know because I asked. A pause. Most people in large buildings learn names when they need something from the person attached to them. I learned them because the person was there. Something moved across Monica's face, not guilt, which she had already done the accounting on, but the feeling that follows guilt when you've completed the accounting and are now deciding what to build on the cleared ground. I want to do something, she said, not as a gesture. The distinction matters to me. A gesture is something you do so you can say you did it, and I've seen enough of them to know. That's mostly for the person making them. He said nothing. Gave her the room to continue. I want to build a veteran reintegration program, she said. Employment placement, transition counseling, professional development for people coming out of service into civilian roles. I have the capital. I have the infrastructure. What I don't have is any genuine understanding of what the transition actually requires from the inside. What I know about it from the outside is, as far as I can tell, approximately useless. You want my input. I want your honest assessment of whether this is a good idea or a well-funded bad idea. Those are different things, and the difference is important. He sat with that for a moment. A real question deserved a real answer, which meant he wasn't going to give it in the next 30 seconds to have given it. It can be a good idea, he said carefully. Whether it is depends entirely on how it's built and who does the building. Programs like this fail when they're designed by people who understand the budget, but not the population. The people who know what the transition actually costs in time, in disorientation, in the specific problem of translating 20 years of skills into language that civilians hiring can recognize. Those people need to be in the room from the first conversation. Not consulted after the structure is set. Okay, I know people who could help you build it correctly. People who've done this work in other contexts, who understand both sides of the experience. I can connect you, he met her eyes. But I won't run it. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't going to ask you to run it. Good. I was going to ask you to consult on the design phase. Paid. At a rate that reflects the expertise you'd be bringing. He looked at her. She looked back. The office had the quality of a space where 2 people were being precise with each other, and finding that precision unexpectedly worked. We can discuss that, he said. She nodded. Then, with the slight shift of someone moving from the business to the thing that had been underneath the business. There's one more thing I want to ask. More personal. You have no obligation to answer. He waited. Do you regret it? She said, coming back to this, to civilian life. 2, her gesture was contained but encompassing, indicating something wider than the office. 2 ordinary things. He took a breath, looked at the overcast skyline through the window. Regret isn't the right word, he said. There are mornings when the scale of what I used to do and the scale of what I do now sit next to each other, and the gap is noticeable. I won't pretend otherwise. A pause. But I chose this. My mother needed someone who would show up every single day, not occasionally, not when it was convenient every day. I am someone who shows up every day. That was the best available use of that quality at that specific point in my life. I don't regret the reason, and the work itself? The work is honest, he said. Something is dirty, I clean it. It's done. I know it's done because I can see it's done. He looked at her. I spent 20 years in situations where the results of what you did took years to become legible, if they ever did. Sometimes they didn't. The work I do now tells me immediately whether I did it right. There's a kind of integrity in that feedback loop that I didn't expect to value as much as I do. She was quiet for a long moment. The office held the quality of a space where something true had just been said and was still finding its level. My mother built a cleaning business, she said. The pivot was unexpected enough that he simply listened. Before I was born, her and her sister, with a van and 3 industrial machines and a client list that started at 6 and grew because they were reliable and meticulous. She sold it when I was 12 to put the money toward the house. A pause. I spent 20 years being grateful for the house without thinking about the business. Without thinking about what it took to build something from 3 machines and 2 people and a telephone you answered yourself because there was no one else to answer it. Something shifted in her voice level but with pressure underneath it. I've been thinking about it recently. What changed? He said. She met his eyes. I started paying attention to names, she said. Specifically the ones I didn't know, the list. He knew, from Patricia, who had told him the way Patricia told him things as a fact of the world, without drama attached, that Monica had requested the full maintenance staff roster Wednesday evening and had read it before leaving the building. He hadn't known what to do with that information when he received it. He still wasn't certain, but it was real, and real things has had a different weight than performed ones. The program, he said, if you build it correctly, and correctly means starting with the people who know what they're talking about, not starting with the budget it could matter. There are people coming out of service who are very good at exactly the things civilian organizations need and very bad at translating that into the language that hiring processes understand. That gap costs people years. Sometimes it costs them more than that. Tell me what the first conversation should look like, she said. If I'm approaching it correctly. He leaned forward slightly and began to talk not about himself, not about his own experience specifically, but about the structural reality of what the transition looked like at the points where it most commonly failed, where the existing programs broke down and why, what the people he knew had navigated well and what had cost them more than it should have. He talked for 20 minutes with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about this gap for 3 years and had not been asked about it until now. She listened. The way she'd listened in the service lot fully, without the divided attention of someone composing their response in the space, the words were still occupying. She took notes by hand on a legal pad, which he noticed and did not comment on. At 1:15 he stood. She stood with him. I'll set up the first conversation, he said. With the people I mentioned, you'll need to come ready to be told things that don't match your existing assumptions, and you'll need to not manage the conversation toward the conclusions you already have. I know how to listen, she said, with the slight edge of someone who is probably right, and also probably a little defensive about being told. I know you do. I've watched you do it twice this week. He looked at her. I'm saying it because the context will be different. These aren't people who have professional reasons to be careful with you. She absorbed that without contesting it. Fair. He moved toward the door. Stopped. Turned back with the quality of someone who has decided to say a thing rather than carry it out unsaid. The list, he said. The 11 names. She met his eyes and held them, which was, he'd come to understand her version of acknowledgement, full attention, no deflection. That mattered, he said. Not because of what came after it. By itself, he left. The elevator going down was empty, which he appreciated. He stood in it and watched the floor numbers descend and thought about the conversation in the way he thought about operations, after the fact, what the objective had been, what had been achieved, what remained, what came next. The objective had clarified during the conversation rather than before it, which was how the more important ones usually worked. What had been achieved was something real. A program that, built correctly, could matter to people navigating the specific disorientation of leaving one life and finding that no one had left instructions for entering the next one. What remained was everything: the first conversation, the design process, the 100 decisions that would determine whether the thing became what it could be or what it usually became, which was a line on a corporate responsibility report and a ribbon cutting. The next action was go back to work. South corridor, then the lobby cycle, then the end-of-day log. The elevator opened. He pushed the cart out of the service junction, adjusted the wheel, started on the south corridor. Patricia passed him on her way back from the lobby with a stack of packages. "How'd it go?" "Fine," he said. She gave him the look of someone who considers that answer insufficient but respects the right to give it. She was on the phone with someone from her foundation contact list before you went up, for context, and she took notes, by hand. "I saw the legal pad when I went in for signatures." She shifted the packages. "I'm just saying, thanks, Patricia. Welcome," she continued toward the elevator bank. Paused. "The wheel on that cart, I know. Gerald in procurement is not a real person," he said. Patricia laughed. "The full one, the one that carried down the corridor and made the space briefly larger than it was, and kept walking. The south corridor was the south corridor. The lobby cycle was the lobby cycle. The end-of-day log was completed at 1:58, 2 minutes ahead of schedule, which was how he preferred things. In the service slot at 2:04, he sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. His phone showed the care center's afternoon check-in. Good day, clear. Had asked around 3 whether he was coming. Sandra had told her yes, 6 o'clock, the usual. He texted back. Sat with the phone in his hand, and the city, doing its Thursday evening things around him, the traffic building on the streets above, the light through the garage entrance going amber gold. The way Atlanta light went in the late afternoon when the overcast thinned. He thought about what his mother had asked him Wednesday night. "Were you seen today?" The question that was small in its construction and enormous in what it held. He thought about Lorraine Mitchell crossing a room. About Monica Reed in the concrete quiet of the service lot, choosing words that were truer than they needed to be. About Jeffrey Lewis carrying 2 coffees through a service corridor to have a conversation nobody had asked him to have. About Patricia's laugh moving through a hallway that didn't otherwise have much warmth in it. The thing about being seen, the thing he'd been working out for 2 years in this building, and longer before it, was that it didn't announce itself in advance. You didn't know it was coming. It didn't require an audience or a ceremony or a general standing up in a room full of federal authority and expensive suits. It could be 2 coffees. It could be a list of 11 names requested at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. It could be a parking lot and a woman in a $4,000 suit saying something she didn't have to say and meaning it. It accumulated. Quietly, without announcing that it was accumulating. And then at some point you looked back, and the accumulation had weight, had changed something in the specific gravity of how you moved through the days, and you couldn't identify the exact moment it happened because it hadn't happened in one moment. It had happened the way most real things happen, gradually, and then, in a way you couldn't miss. He started the truck. The bakery on Peachtree came through. Right rolls. 5:22 on the clock. 8 minutes inside closing, which he logged internally as a minor operational success and acknowledged without ceremony. He parked in an actual legitimate spot at Briarwood, 4 spaces from the entrance, available, which he noted without assigning it significance beyond the fact that it was convenient, and he was grateful for convenient things when they occurred. Sandra was at the desk. Tuesday had been 4 braids. Tonight was back to 2. A different style than Monday, and he thought his mother would notice and have an opinion, because his mother noticed things and had opinions about most of them, which was one of the qualities he loved most about her and found most useful about being her son. "She's been up since 4, Sandra said. "Good day, full day." She reorganized her bookshelf, By what system? Sandra's expression carried something between professional neutrality and genuine amusement, color. She went left to right, pale to dark. When I asked her about it, she said authors are arbitrary, but color is honest. Darnell stood with the paper bag and turned that over for a moment. She's not wrong, I told her that. She seemed unsurprised that I agreed with her. He walked the hallway. The squeak near room 2 unfixed, now a landmark. The warm medicinal smell of the place that he'd stopped registering as institutional and now registered simply as here, as the smell of this particular place, that held this particular person. His mother was at the bookshelf, not reorganizing she'd finished. The books stood in a gradient that ran from pale creams and yellows on the left through greens and blues to deep burgundies and near blacks on the right, and the effect was quietly beautiful in the specific way of things that weren't trying to be beautiful, and ended up that way, regardless. She heard him at the door, and turned, the door behind her eyes, open, full, the light coming through. He held up the bag. She said, "Sit down, don't make it a thing." He sat. She sat across from him and took a roll, and they ate in the easy quiet of people who had accumulated enough hard silences together that the easy ones had become a form of wealth, something to receive without analyzing, something that had value precisely because it didn't need to justify itself. She asked about his day. He told her more than usual because she was clear, and because the day had been the kind that deserved more than the condensed version. He told her about the office on the 41st floor, about the woman who had asked a real question and then actually listened to the real answer, about the program that might become something not certainly, nothing was certain, but possibly, if it was built correctly, which depended on a series of decisions that hadn't been made yet and would require people willing to be told they were wrong before they were right. His mother listened with the attention she brought to everything. She still brought full attention to hearing what was said, and the shape of what surrounded what was said, which she'd always been able to do and which the disease had not yet reached. She apologized, his mother said. The right way? Close enough that it counted. That's not nothing. That's actually rare. She pulled another piece from the roll, ate it from her palm. What are you going to do with it? Help her build something if she builds it right, and if she builds it wrong? Tell her she's building it wrong, he said. And she'd decide whether to listen. His mother looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say the next thing or hold it. She said it. You've always been patient with people who weren't sure they deserved it. He considered that. Maybe patience is only worth something when it's not certain the other person has earned it yet. She turned that over the way. She turned things over deliberately, without rushing to a verdict. That's a better answer than I expected, she said finally. You raised me to have decent answers. I raised you to have honest ones, she said. Decent is something you worked out on your own. The evening light through the window went golden, and then amber, and then the deeper orange that preceded full dark. The sky outside doing what it did at the end of days that had had more in them than the morning suggested. The bookshelf stood against the wall in its color gradient with the quiet satisfaction of a completed thing. The butter rolls were mostly gone. The chair held the shape of him. His mother's eyes went soft around 8 o'clock. Not the abrupt closing of exhaustion, but the gradual softening of a person returning to a place that required less navigation than being awake. He waited until her breathing changed and then reached for the blanket at the foot of the bed and laid it across her lap. With the care he brought to that motion every time, the same attention he brought to the small things that were, in the actual accounting, not small at all. He sat a few minutes longer, not doing anything. Not thinking about anything particular. Just present in the room, in the chair that held the shape of him, in the building that smelled like here rather than institutional. In the particular quality of stillness that arrives when the logistics of a day have resolved. And what remains is simply the fact of being in a room with another person, both of you in the world, both of you known. He drove home with the windows down. The Atlanta night was warm and legible traffic and music, and the ambient noise of a city that didn't stop. Several million people carrying their individual weights through the common space, none of them aware of the other's particular burdens, all of them carrying them nonetheless. He parked, walked up, unlocked the door. The apartment was spare, and clean the single photograph on the wall, the efficient arrangement of a person who had made peace with the space being functional, rather than expressive, though he'd thought sometimes about changing that, about whether functional and expressive had to be separate categories. Maybe that was next. One of the optimizations in the back of the queue, behind the inspiring lunches and the parking situation and the accumulated small improvements that waited for the time after the necessary things. He made tea, stood at the window. Atlanta at night was a different argument than Atlanta in the morning. In the morning, the towers made the case for ambition, for the upward aspiration of things built to be impressive. At night, they made a different case, something about scale and permanence, about the fact of being present and lit in the dark, which was its own form of statement. He looked at it for a while, didn't try to draw a conclusion from it. Sometimes the looking was enough. His phone showed a message from the care center, the routine late evening check-in. His mother was sleeping well. Good day. Full notes in the log. He texted back a thank you. Put the phone down, finished the tea, washed the cup, put it away in the place where it went. The next morning would start the same way. Wheels on marble, the low slosh of water in a bucket, the cart's front wheel pulling, left in the way it had been pulling left for 6 weeks, compensated for by the same small automatic adjustment that had become as natural as breathing a correction, so incorporated into the movement that it was no longer a correction, but simply the way the movement went. The Z pattern through the lobby, the drain under the entrance mat. The building not yet awake, the early shift finding the spaces quiet. On Friday morning, when he arrived at 6:43, 2 things had changed. The first was small, a work order confirmation on his phone from the facilities system. Replacement wheel assembly, cart unit 7, arrival estimated Monday. Gerald in procurement had apparently been located. The second was in the lobby. Monica Reed came out of the elevator at 7:51, the same time she always came down. The same decisive stride across the marble, the same quality of presence that made the room organize itself slightly differently around her. She was heading for the main entrance, where her car would be waiting. She saw him. He was near the mat, running the morning check, crouched down to test the drainage, the same position he'd been in on Monday when the week had started the way it had started. He looked up. She stopped, not long. Not dramatically. Just long enough to make it deliberate rather than coincidental. She nodded, once. The nod of a person who is not performing acknowledgement, but actually making it the difference visible in the quality of the attention behind it. He nodded back. She continued to the door. He continued with the mat. The building filled around them. Footsteps accumulating, the elevator banks beginning their morning rhythms, the low white noise of 2,400 people, beginning another day in the 47th-floor tower that rose above Peachtree Street, with its glass and its ambition, and its ordinary extraordinary cargo of people who were, each of them, more than the function they were there to perform. The mat was dry this morning. No pooling under the edge, no residual moisture from overnight. He replaced it, checked the drain channel, confirmed the positions of the safety indicators, and moved the cart toward the south side of the lobby to start the morning cycle. Left wheel. Compensate. Move forward, small corrections. That was always the job. Not the dramatic interventions, not the moments of public reckoning, not the ceremonies, or the acknowledgements, or the rare occasions when the truth arranged itself into visibility. Those happened, they mattered, but they were not the job itself. The job was the corridor ahead of you, and the floor that needed doing, and the consistency of showing up to do it, every morning, regardless of whether anyone was going to notice, or whether the week ahead held anything other than the ordinary accumulation of tasks that a large building required to remain what it was supposed to be. He'd chosen this corridor. He moved through it. The building kept going around him. the way buildings do, full of its own motion, its own purposes, its 2,400 individual trajectories crossing and recrossing through the shared space. Somewhere above him, Monica Reed was beginning whatever the day required of her. Somewhere in the security office, Jeffrey Lewis was running his morning check of the camera feeds. Somewhere on the 22nd floor, Vanessa Carter was opening her calendar. And somewhere on the line between Atlanta and wherever the DoD's technical review was being conducted, the decision about $847 million was working its way toward a conclusion, which came back Thursday of the following week in an email to Monica Reed that included Lorraine Mitchell's name in the signature block and a single added line at the bottom of the formal acceptance language that said, simply, "Looking forward to it." The lobby filled with morning light. Darnell Cooper pushed the cart to the next position, checked the drain, straightened the mat, did the work that needed doing. Outside, Atlanta moved the way it always moved, fast and deliberate and indifferent to whatever fell beneath it, and also in the ordinary way of large things that contain multitudes, quietly capable of something more than that. The towers along Peachtree caught the early light and held it for a moment, each pane of glass briefly a mirror, before the angle shifted and the reflection gave way to transparency, the building showing itself rather than the sky. 47 floors, 2,400 people. 11 names. 11 names on a list that one of those people had finally learned. One cart with a wheel that would be replaced on Monday. Compensation no longer necessary. The small automatic adjustment that had become habitual dissolving back into the category of things that simply didn't need doing anymore. Some mornings that was enough. Most mornings, actually, this one included.